building out.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of the rest of the staff at Town Hall and our friends at the Elliott Bay Book Company, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation of Kate Aronoff in conversation with Bill McKibben as part of our Civics series. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for joining us here on our new streaming platform, My Town Hall Seattle. We hope you were able to reach the program easily and are enjoying the benefit of accessing your tickets and events easily in one virtual location. Like everything at Town Hall, it's a work in progress. So if you have any questions or concerns, please use the patron services email you'll find in the chat below. Tonight's conversation will run around 60 minutes, including the Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field at the bottom of the video player. You may have to scroll down to see it, and please feel free to add yours at any time. We can't guarantee we'll get to every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. You can do your part by keeping your questions concise, as we like to say, in the form of a question. For those who'd like to view the program with closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall's adding new programs every day. Upcoming events include Danielle Sered and Nikita Oliver discussing practical and moral solutions to replace mass incarceration. Also this Sunday, our Town Music series concludes for the year with Why Music, presenting the world premiere performance of a new work entitled Together by composer Judd Greenstein. And we're excited to introduce you to our latest artist in residence, Timothy White Eagle, with a 3-month exploration of Native American and other earth-based spiritual practices. You can check out more of what's upcoming by visiting our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our civics programs are supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, the Northcliffe Foundation, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But as most of you know, Town Hall is at heart a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight. One last piece of infomercial. You will definitely want to go deeper into tonight's topic, so I hope you'll consider purchasing your copy of Kate Aronoff's book tonight from our partners at Elliott Bay instead of later from another online retailer of, everything else. Town Hall asks you to think about keeping it local, and just maybe the things we love about this city from before the pandemic will still be around to delight us on the other side. And with that, Kate Aronoff is a staff writer at the New Republic and a former fellow at the Type Media Center. Her work has appeared in The Intercept, The New York Times, The Nation, Dissent, Rolling Stone, and The Guardian, among other outlets. Aronoff is the co-editor of the book We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism, American Style, which came out last year, and the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, published in 2019. Bill McKibben is an author, environmentalist, and the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, was translated into 24 languages, along with many other books, including his latest, Falter, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out, published in 2019. He is a founder of 350.org, the first planet-wide grassroots climate change movement. A former staff writer for The New Yorker, he writes frequently for a wide variety of publications, and in 2014 was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel. Kate Aronoff's book, Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Bill McKibben and Kate Aronoff.
Weir, what a gracious introduction. And let me just say for me, what a terrific pleasure to be back at Town Hall, even if only virtually. I feel like I should disappear for a second and then reappear as if through the door behind the stage there. As so many times before, it's one of the great places in the whole country, and everybody's looking forward to seeing what it looks like once once we're back on our feet and once Town Hall is fully refurbished. So many thanks for having us. I'm just going to begin by saying my goal tonight is very simple: to bring out the thoughts of Kate Aronoff, and to get you to push that button and buy her book. Um, she is an extraordinarily important voice in the most important fight that the world has ever faced. She's writing constantly some of the most acute and powerful and insightful things that get written about climate change. And I am extraordinarily grateful for the chance to read it all the time in places like the New Republic. But now this book takes it to a new level. And here's the thing about books. I mean, I've written a lot of them. There's old books, that's what the library is for. And it's a very good thing that libraries exist. It's one of the things that makes writing fun, knowing that everybody can read what you write. But new books, and especially books early in an author's career, it's really important to sell a bunch of them too. And so that we make sure that Kate can go on writing more books for years to come, because we badly need that voice out there. So I'm going to return to that commercial once or twice in the course of the evening. But just to say, for me, what a pleasure to be here. And Kate, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well, especially after that introduction. Thank you so much, Bill, for that. I'm not great at promoting myself, so it's nice to outsource that labor
It's much easier to have
sometimes.
someone else. Yes, that's one of the few kinds of labor we should outsource.
And
Yeah,
thank you so much to everyone at Town Hall for hosting. I was saying before, I'm very excited to see the space and to see Seattle for the first time, where I've never been, unfortunately.
good heavens. Well, can I ask a question to start? Because one of the sort of conceits of the book is that capitalism writ large and neoliberalism writ small are kind of at the center of a lot of the um, trouble that we face. We've just come through a week where um, the US was doing its best to reassume kind of control of the climate debate with a day of world leaders phoning in to chat with President Biden and make their pledges, followed by a day with billionaire CEOs doing the same thing. And tell us just kind of your reaction to last week. You wrote a beautiful piece in the Times last week, but just give us some sense of, how optimistic are we allowed to feel? What, and how should we be trying to bend all this now?
Yeah, well, I'll start off by saying the book was in part inspired by attending slightly similar conferences to the to the one that happened last week. Obviously, not on Zoom, not at the White House, but similar in kind, right? Events where world leaders sort of come together, make a lot of pledges that sound pretty good, which I think a lot of the things that were said last week sounded. But it's been roughly 30 years of these types of events, about as old as I am, and we are not much closer, to solving this crisis, especially in the United States, where we still don't have a climate law to make good on these pledges. And the gap, is just still so big between what's required, what very sort of sober science says about where we need to be, and even what's being pledged as a sort of high water mark that itself will be very difficult to meet. And for folks who may not have been tracking as closely as people whose job it is to pay attention to this sort of stuff in granular detail, Joe Biden pledged as a requirement of rejoining the Paris Agreement, which Donald Trump, of course, left, to re-up the United States commitment and cut emissions by 50% below 2005 levels by 2030, which it's good that we have a new pledge. It's good to be in accordance with the Paris Agreement. That pledge is, of course, very far off from what it is that the United States owes to the rest of the world, given our historical responsibility for this crisis and the massive resources that the United States has to both transition our own economy off of fossil fuels very quickly and to help the rest of the world do that as well with financial support that has been a consistent demand from the global south for about as long as these types of things have been happening. So I am a cynic a little bit of these types of events, having covered too many of them. I tried to not provide too much excruciating detail about the psychic horrors of attending UN climate talks, but they are, sort of sensory deprivation tanks in some sense. But I think that the second day of the summit, which I'll admit I didn't track so closely, again, sort of wanted to focus on other things, but I still think there has been a lot of progress that's worth taking stock of, right, in terms of how the US and how the White House is talking about climate change. I mean, I certainly would not have predicted during the Democratic primary that Joe Biden would have passed a $1.9 trillion stimulus that he would be talking about $1 trillion of climate spending, right? That's a big step change. It's the most ambitious plan we've seen from a Democratic White House. And it's not nearly enough. It's still not nearly enough, which is just the sort of crushing math that, Bill, you've written about so well. That is just the reality of this crisis, right? We can come a very long way, but the bar is still so low after 4 years of Donald Trump denying that the problem exists, that the fossil fuel industry has dragged the conversation so far into the gutter that even saying this is a problem worth taking on in the United States seems like progress, which it is in some sense, but is just really far below what's needed. And sort of highlighting people like Bill Gates at that summit, who should be at the center of every global scandal in the world, given his refusal to his consistent defense of patents for life-saving drugs, is scandalous, right? And that's a big part of what I look at in the book is, what is the sort of process by which corporations and the private sector became the protagonists of the climate fight and not government, which is the most obvious sort of agent for taking on this crisis, can do all the things we want it to do. And Bill Gates is offering. I don't want to talk too much about him tonight, but is offering, I think, a pretty incomplete set of solutions to this problem. And the types of things that I lay out in the book, some ideas that would fall under the rubric of a Green New Deal, look to recenter the state as a democratized state, as a protagonist, and something that, like during the New Deal, like at different points in U.S. history, has been seen as a positive force in people's lives. And I think that is the sort of task of climate policy, is to sort of make the case that taking on this crisis can be something that improves the vast majority of people's lives. And I don't think we're going to get that through the billionaires.
I think if you were going to make the best case for our kind of what's going on in our politics right now, it's that maybe Biden is resetting things a little to kind of the pre-Reagan world, and at least accepting the idea that government needn't be the problem, that it actually can be the solution in a lot of cases. But that's a hard case to make after 40 years of having Reaganism drilled into our body politic. So it makes it a moment of extraordinary interest. There's a lot of interesting things going on. Let me ask you a question that I was trying to write about this week a little bit, but I can't sort of figure out in my own mind how to think about it. It's one of the, you mentioned in passing in this Great Times piece that, one of the problems that we're going to be having to figure out is how to deal with other countries, which means especially China, going forward. And John Kerry was able to get China to come to this thing and say what it was going to say. And then the next day, the foreign minister of China said, yeah, we'll keep cooperating as long as the rest of the world stays out of our internal affairs in Xinjiang and Hong Kong and so on and so forth. And it's this sort of strange conundrum that we have this huge problem that we that will overwhelm the whole planet, and yet it seems completely wrong to ignore the immediate problems that are wrecking, 1 million people in internment camps in Xinjiang. How do you think about how we manage to take on both these kind of things at once as a global society? It strikes me that's one of the real powers of the book, that it imagines a world where this becomes an issue. It sort of takes up where Naomi Klein left off and imagines a world where this becomes a kind of lever for making lots of different change.
Yeah, and I thank you for that question. And I wish I had talked a little bit more about China in the book, honestly, just given how sort of center stage it is, especially now. I mean, it has been for many years, but exactly that tension, right? Is that, there are horrible, horrible things happening within China, and it's the biggest polluter on earth now. And it's hard to imagine any path toward climate action without the United States and China working together. So, I don't know if I have any magical answers, but in the book, sort of try to come up with, a kind of values framework to try to start thinking through that question, which is, that I think solidarity is a sort of solid bedrock on which to build any sort of program in that regard. And, it's my belief that working people in the United States have more in common with working people in China than they do with oligarchs in their own country. And I think that's, certainly a tough conversation to have. It's not free speech in China in the ways that, there is in the United States. And so those sort of direct lines are tough. But I've, seen some really exciting work happening from, folks like Tabitha Chow at People's Action, which is trying to build sort of bridges between working folks in different parts of the world. And I think, one thing that I wish was talked about a bit more and is directly relevant to this question is, what does solar power look like? What does wind power look like? I think there's been this idea for a long time that bringing more wind and solar onto the grid is sort of a good in itself, and that's it, right? And that, these companies are sort of good actors and are on the right side of history, as it were. And I think that's probably in broad strokes more true, certainly, than it is of the fossil fuel industry, who are, have been misleading the public about the reality of climate change for a very long time, are bad actors on virtually every count. But I think it's worth understanding that solar and wind companies, especially as these industries grow and evolve, are companies, right? They are companies with an interest in making money. That is legally what they're required to do. And some parts of that supply chain, including, especially the solar supply chain that is being in part sourced by, forced labor in parts of China, are really suspect and should be called into question. I mean, looking sort of up and down the length of kind of what makes, whether it's a solar panel or an electric car or a wind turbine function, is really informative. My friend and co-author Theoria Frankas has done really great work looking at particularly the sort of critical minerals involved in battery production, things like lithium and cobalt, and the labor practices involved there. And I think it's worth being sort of thoughtful about what kinds of societies, a world that's running predominantly on wind and solar is creating, right? Because we see with the history of the fossil fuel industry that, coal sort of breeds a certain set of social relations that lends itself to certain types of societies. In that case, there are all these choke points that arise across the coal supply chain, whether people are transporting them over rail or down in the mines or, burning them in factories. There are all these choke points that arise where workers can really intervene and not just sort of change labor conditions within the coal industry, but can, make demands for things like a welfare state in Victorian England, which is part of why there were things like the end of child labor, was the strength of miners' unions, right? And that's also why, as Timothy Mitchell, this is sort of his book, Carbon Democracy, really makes this point. That's part of why we get oil, right? It's because it's easier to transmit over these long distances without, pesky things like disruption from workers. So, there's been some talk about whether transitioning to wind and solar, because, especially solar is more decentralized, lends itself to a different sort of society, whether that can, lend itself to more sort of democratic forms of ownership in the energy sector, but also more broadly, whether it will have this sort of like transformative effect on the way our societies are run. And I don't think that's a given, right? And I think that part of making that happen, I would like to see solar sort of give way to a more democratic society. But that involves a fight over what those supply chains look like, and really thinking through just the materiality of it, from where minerals are coming from, how much the people who are building wind turbines and solar and installing solar panels are making, whether they can join a union and fight for, fight to organize their workplaces, and that the story of how to build up a lot of solar and wind power leads directly back to China, because they are, a major market force in those supply chains by virtue of having put forward 40 years of industrial policy to build up those industries. So I think so. My slightly cop-out answer is to say that I think solidarity is a sort of framework, and to really look at who's building this stuff and try to think through that, and not to give in to the worst impulses of both countries, the most sort of like nationalistic, gross elements, because we have plenty of nationalists here. There are plenty of right-wing nationalists in China, and I don't know if Ted Cruz and his ilk are really making much headway in making the world a better place by egging on a new Cold War.
One of the things that's happening at the moment that's fascinating is the tension around the world as we watch vaccines start to roll out, about who's going to get them and how and why. And it really mirrors, in many ways, the questions about how we should be taking responsibility for the kind of carbon debt that we owe the rest of the world. I was happy and to see that Greta Thunberg the other day said, you know what, I don't think I'm going to go to the next UN conference on climate, because the vaccine inequality means that lots of poor countries may not be able to get there. And I thought, I have a feeling that may be intervention enough to make sure that they vaccinate all the people that need to get vaccinated. But there really is, it seems to me, a strong lesson there, a strong parallel. What else from the pandemic year has struck you as we've lived through it? What have you been thinking about?
Yeah, I think starting off, I mean, there was a lot. I mean, I started my job at the New Republic in January of 2020. And so the coronavirus was sort of firmly on the climate desk for probably about a month and a half, and then slowly spread out into everything else, which I think is, as good a metaphor as any for the climate crisis, and that it really does, touch everything in the way that COVID does. But one of the things that was, a little surprised me was just the way that the virus sort of spread out, right? It was, after infections spread in China and throughout other parts of Asia, countries like Italy and Spain and, relatively wealthy nations that got hit very hard and struggled to respond to the crisis in a real way. And of course, the United States' outbreak was horrible. I mean, I've been living in New York the whole time, and through, months and months of writing this book, the main thing I heard was sirens going past my house in Brooklyn. And so it really, I think, inverted some of the scripts about the climate crisis, right? I mean, you saw almost overnight Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, leaders throughout the world, go from treating COVID as this foreign policy thing that needed to be responded to with aid and compassion and, being talked about like any number of other things that happens in halfway around the world, to being a pressing foreign domestic crisis. And that, is in broad strokes slightly similar, to climate, right? It's talked about as this thing that's far off, this thing that's only, needs to be responded to in this sort of long-term way, with vague commitments abroad, but is reaching American shores. I think it's easy to forget that 2020 started off with fires in Australia, devastating wildfires, and there were devastating wildfires in California throughout the pandemic, and natural disasters, quote unquote natural disasters, did not slow down as the virus is spreading out. And so that's one thing. I mean, it just sort of inverted some of the scripts about this, but also saw the coronavirus, spread out in broadly the ways that our society is very unequal, right? It was predominantly, Black and brown folks who were hit worst by this crisis, and down to zip codes, right? In terms of not only who was worst hit, where the most fatalities were, but also who got access first to vaccines. And I think that's, really playing out in such a brutal way right now, with vaccine apartheid, and seeing this sort of attempt to try and fix the problem within our own borders, and knowing that that's inadequate. I mean, it feels so just, obvious on its face that if a new variant takes off somewhere in the world that is allowed to grow and evolve and, potentially exceed the vaccine, that will come back to bite us, no matter how many vaccines the US hoards, right? No matter how many vaccines the global north can sort of, collect, and how many patents that Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson are allowed to keep and keep making money off of for years to come. If there's some new variant that takes that on, then that comes back to bite us. And that's directly relevant to the climate crisis, right? If, we can we can decarbonize our own economy very quickly in the US, we can, go through great strides to close down coal plants and do everything we can to make the US a very green place. If that's not complemented by an effort to make that possible for other parts of the world, carbon's still going to rise above the atmosphere. Methane is still going to rise into the atmosphere, and it doesn't really care, where they come from. If it's coming from somewhere, it's hurting all of us. And that demands a collective response. It just makes no sense, right, to have that play out, have that policy response play out in nationalistic terms that, frame it as a competition that we're going to win the future somehow. It hurts all of us if we don't take this on collectively. And I think COVID has made that lesson clear, I would hope. And I'd just say maybe the last thing on this point is that I've been surprised, I think, how much COVID has seemed to wipe away a lot of sort of older scripts about austerity, about the amount of spending that's responsible. I think it's a big part of why we've seen the Biden administration, throw out old ideas about, what kind of spending makes sense, and even, keep people like Larry Summers out of the administration, who famously kept the stimulus after the Great Recession under $1 trillion, not because of any sober economic analysis, but because he put his pundit hat on and said that, you know, people wouldn't like $1 trillion and nobody would vote for it. So, you know, those ideas and those people in a like very real sense are now on the outside. And so it has sort of opened up a new conversation about how much money we can spend in general in the US, which is very good for the climate crisis.
I may have the pandemic on my mind because I just got my second shot, and they was reading me while I waited my 15 minutes to see if I was going to keel over. I read the CDC checklist of all the side effects that might be developing in me. And first on the list, actually, it says feeling of impending doom. And I suddenly was struck by the horrible thought that perhaps my entire last 30 years of my career has just been a reaction to some bad medicine or something long ago. But feeling of impending doom seems actually slightly like what we all should be exhibiting at the moment. I think you're so right about the pandemic and the way that it interacted with the other important story of the year, the lessons that people seem to be learning in the wake of George Floyd's murder. You know, the most important thing anybody said last year was what he said when he was being killed. I can't breathe, because that's kind of the bottom line for us. And, you know, obviously you can't breathe if there's a racist cop kneeling on your neck. But as activists were quick to point out, you know, you can't breathe if there's a gas-fired power plant down the road and it's always the same road. You know, I mean, African Americans have 3 times the asthma rate of white Americans, not because of physiology, because of geography. You can't breathe because, you know, the governor of your state in the West Coast has told you to go inside and tape the windows shut because the wildfires have gotten so bad. And I think you're right. The most important thing that might come out of all of this is some renewed sense of solidarity. We've lived our lives in the post-Reagan era convinced that markets were going to solve all problems. And, you know, Reagan's famous laugh line always in his speeches was the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Ha ha ha. You know, this last year we've learned that the scariest words in the English language are things like "we run out of ventilators," or "the hillside behind your house is on fire," or, you know, which are not things that yield to easily to, you know, market forces or whatever. So I think you're right. I'm hopeful that maybe some things shifted decisively over the last year. I'm going to remind people that one of the reasons we're here tonight is so that you can buy Kate Aronoff's book from Elliott Bay, from the very good people at Elliott Bay, who I hope are hanging on strong throughout the pandemic, because it's one of the great institutions on the West Coast of the United States. And I can't wait for the next time I get to visit. I think there's a button down there someplace that allows you to buy this book, and you should. As you can tell, Kate's a very good speaker, and she's at least as good as a writer. Thoughtful and analytic, but also just a gifted writer, which actually really matters. This is difficult stuff, and it has to be laid out in a way that we can understand. So I think we're starting to get a few questions beginning to come in from the people who are paying attention. I'm going to pass them on. Someone is asking, this is a good question, Kate. What brings you to continue reporting on climate issues? What gives you the drive to work on these issues? despite the fact that they make us feel despair. Um, and, tell us a little bit about how you first got into this work.
Yeah. Well, just to circle back quickly on something you said earlier, and to direct people toward toward a piece of the book. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the last year has seen not just COVID, but a real uprising in cities around the country for racial justice, and something I talk a bit about in the book, and which I think is really worth thinking through, is raising attention to how cities, how governments, how our federal government spends money and allocates resources, which I think are a real expression of values. Cities spend an inordinate amount of their budgets on policing, right, and on things that on centering services that should be nowhere near a police department, right? Things like mental health, basic social services that are, for some reason, mostly because of white supremacy, put in the purview of police where they don't belong at all. And so I, talk through this concept of a nonviolent economy, which comes from Coretta Scott King, fighting with people like Bayard Rustin and the labor movement, parts of the New Left for full employment in the 1970s, and really, has this very sort of holistic concept of thinking about public budgets as an expression of values and as something which decides what our priorities are as a society. And I think the thing I would like to leave people with in the book is thinking about that question and thinking about the fact that where we put our money really shows where we put our values, and that should not be on policing, certainly, and should be dedicated towards social services, toward taking on this crisis and creating a good life for as many people as possible. Which if you look at our federal budget right now, with its ballooning military budget, ever growing investment in expanding military bases and fighter jets and all these things we don't need abroad, I think that's a pretty skewed look at our priorities. So I would direct people toward that part of the book. In terms of how I keep writing about this and how I started writing about that, I think they're two sort of related questions. Bill, as you know, and you've done sort of similar work, I started getting interested in the stuff by working on the fossil fuel divestment movement in college as a freshman. And did that for 4 years, working to get Swarthmore College to take its endowment out of fossil fuels. Still has not done that, but many other institutions have since we started that campaign, and since Bill went around the country getting other campuses to take up that fight very successfully. So still a little bitter about the fact that Swarthmore has not done that, but very glad many other institutions have. So was in the climate movement for all through college, and then realized at some point that I was a bit better at writing than I was at organizing, and so decided to do that. And really, what keeps me going, I think, is getting to talk to people who are doing that work, who are doing work to not just on climate sort of specifically, but are thinking through these questions at a really deep level, whether they're academics or organizers. And that's kind of what I tried to bring to the book, is just I get to talk to experts on this stuff, which is really fun. Experts on movement building, experts on climate modeling, who are situated in very different places in the world, experts on, what it's like to live with fossil fuel infrastructure in your backyard. So that is incredible. I mean, it's an incredible job, and I feel lucky to get to do it every day and just talk to very smart, interesting people so often, and think through that with them. Yeah.
It's a great moment I got to say, for climate journalism. I get to write every week this little free newsletter for the New Yorker on climate, and a lot of it is just trying to collect and highlight the great work that people are doing. and Kate is at the forefront of this, but there are a lot of other people who are doing wonderful work right now. And I take particular pleasure in it because I remember many years when there was no one doing this work and it was very lonely. And I'm endlessly grateful for the fact that there's now a big core of people doing fantastic work. But because, the nature of the mediums that we work in now, a lot of it's short, fragmented, whatever else, a good reminder that we need books too, and books like the one that Kate's just published. So Kate, let's go off your subtitle here. Someone asks, and this is a question that often get asked, do we have to completely get rid of capitalism before we deal with climate change? Is that the right way to be thinking about this? Or is there some, because it seems unlikely to me that in the 9 years that the IPCC has given us to, fundamentally transform our energy system, we're going to completely get rid of capitalism. Is there some way to sort of think about how we move, how we use this process where we have to go through because of physics and chemistry to substantially shift and change what we mean when we say capitalism?
That is an excellent and often asked question in these circles. Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Bill. We have such a punishingly short amount of time to take on this crisis. And I do not think that we are going to get rid of a hundreds of years old system of production and distribution in time to do that, right? And rebuild a worker-owned alternative. I don't think the math is on our side with that. That said, I think there are real limits to the ability of capitalism as it's currently structured, which I think is a belief system as well as an economic system and a productive system, to take on this crisis at scale. And so, what I like to say is that we have to replace capitalism as society's operating system, and create metrics for success that are not endless growth, that are not as much private accumulation of wealth as possible. With that said, again, I'll just keep going back and forth between little caveats here. I think capitalist markets will produce solar panels, they will produce wind turbines, they will produce many of the things that we need. That is just sort of what we're looking at in a best case scenario, is that people will get rich off of doing the things that we need in the short term. But I think the lesson of history is that you need a strong labor movement and strong social movements in order to keep those sort of profit-seeking impulses in check. And I think it's both a danger, as I said earlier, that there will be a new class of solar barons or wind barons, and people who are on the right side of the energy mix but the wrong side of history, who are trying to make their name in this stuff, including companies like Shell and BP, who are increasingly getting interested in things like power production in the US and all over the world. And it's been unions who have provided a check on those things and been able to sort of constrain capital in the ways that make for a better society overall, and keep the kind of profit-seeking impulses of executives from cutting into societal gains. And so I think that is a sort of principle to move forward with on climate. And I would think of a lot of the things I lay out in the book as kind of non-reformist reforms, which is I think Andre Gore's termed that. I might be getting that wrong, but things that lead to a better society overall and are not just sort of doubling down on what we've got now, because I think it is possible for extraction to keep up even as we transition to a new energy mix, and that would be both a shame, and I think it also doesn't get us where we need to be. I don't think you extend renewable power to everyone who needs it in the sort of confines of capitalism. And so I think there need to be a different set of values imparted into this massive project of decarbonization over the next decade in order to make it really work. And I don't trust the private sector to carry that out to satisfaction.
I think that may be one of the places where this will really be decided. is in the financial industry, which in many ways is the key underpinning of the fossil fuel industry at the moment. And one of the things that I think one can be hopeful about or work on, and this goes to a question that will, from a listener that we'll get to in a minute, are there bills in Congress right now that we need to be doing more advocacy around? I think one of the places we might want to be doing a lot of advocacy is around executive action the Treasury and the Federal Reserve and the SEC seem to me key players going forward. And that one thing we might come out of the next 4 years with is, forcing every company in America to assess its climate risk and things like that, that might begin to, what are some of the other things, you've talked a little bit about what Janet Yellen is doing at the Treasury and things. What are some of the other things along that line that interest you?
Yeah, I guess I'll break them out into the kind of legislative and then executive powers side of things. So on the legislative side, everyone is looking at the infrastructure bill, obviously, and kind of what all we can jam in there, because we have a fundamentally anti-democratic political system that makes it very difficult to pass laws. And that is massively unrepresentative of this country and, antebellum institution called the Senate. It should probably not exist in a small d democracy. All that said, so everyone's looking at the infrastructure bill, and we've seen a lot of good proposals for what that could look like and what it could look like to make that bill, worth something. Just last week, the Green New Deal resolution was reintroduced in the House, and along with it, a series of, I think, really important bills to make good on that, and which could fit very naturally into the infrastructure conversation. A Green New Deal for public housing that would create hundreds of thousands of jobs. A Green New Deal for cities, which would provide resources for cities around the country to start their own sort of mini Green New Deals. Regardless of what their, what state governments say, which is really important, for places like Austin or, Bloomington, Indiana, and other places sort of stuck in, unfortunately, not climate friendly state legislatures, to be able to, to enact their own local Green New Deals, a civilian climate corps, making a 21st century sort of version of the CCC that I talk a bit about in the book, which put people to work building a lot of the public infrastructure people have been enjoying through the pandemic, and our parks and trails and things like ski lodges and hunting lodges that the CCC made, and many parts of this country that is still going strong. I think just the numbers need to go up of the infrastructure bill, right? The roughly, generously speaking, $1 trillion of spending on climate that Biden proposed is much too small. That's sort of what I think is a sort of bare minimum is, a $10 trillion investment over a decade, $1 trillion a year, $1 trillion over 8 years, which is what's on the table now, is just totally unacceptable in terms of the scale of what's needed. So upping the numbers, and I would say the PRO Act is a really important thing to get behind. The Democratic Socialists of America, joined by the Sunrise Movement and a number of labor unions. This is the number one priority of labor movement in the country, and is both an important piece of legislation in itself, peeling back a lot of the regressive changes to labor law that have happened since the New Deal, and a really important, I think, coalition building opportunity to show real solidarity between climate activists who are getting behind it and the labor movement, and really undercutting a lot of the really tired, bad faith lines about jobs versus the environment, by fighting for something which could make it possible for solar and wind workers to get good, strong union contracts and create a clean energy economy that's worth fighting for. And Joe Biden has gotten behind that sort of full-throatedly, and could make it through the reconciliation. So that's all very exciting stuff. I'm not a magician of knowing legislative processes, but that's all. Those are the things that I would be paying attention to.
I'm glad you gave a shout out to cities, because there's a lot of important work going on, and including there in Seattle, which has always been one of the real hotbeds of the climate movement. And so, so many thanks to everybody from Climate Solutions to the 350 Seattle crew to Mazoska Talks to on and on and on, local Sunrise, just people doing amazing work. And that kind of line that activists across the Northwest managed to kind of draw, that kept coal ports from being built and that kind of thing, have been extraordinarily important. We probably should give a thought tonight as we're talking to our remarkable colleagues up in Minnesota who are working hard on this Line 3 debacle and really beginning to pressure the Biden administration to not only be for good things, but against bad things, which is always harder for politicians. Here's a question from someone that I think is about as softball. If I didn't know better, I'd say your mother was writing in. Would Kate have?
She might be.
Would Kate have some words of how her book is organized and the topics she covers? So give us a 2 or 3 minute précis of Overheated, so that people have some sense of what it is they're buying.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Whoever wrote it, including if that's my mom, who I didn't think was watching tonight, but could be. So hi, Mom. So the first half, roughly, of the book looks at how we got here. So what is it that got us into this place of not being able to sort of consider the sort of scale of solutions that we need? So I start back at the Columbian Exchange, and don't stay there too long, but I think it's important to take into account the legacy of colonialism and slavery and building the system we have today, and the foundational role that continues to play in our thought process around climate action and everything else in society. So that chunk looks roughly at the last 40 or 50 years or so of the first half of the book. So looking at carbon pricing, looking at the fight over cap and trade in 2009 and 2010 as sort of a cautionary tale of trying to appeal to industry, and what the UN process has how that's evolved, and the ideas that have been taken off the table, how ideas have been taken off the table for not only a more equal United States, but a more equal world order, which is, shows up just time and time and again in any kind of UN climate discussion. And so the second half of the book kind of kicks off with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with the Sunrise Movement occupying Nancy Pelosi's office in 2018, calling for a Green New Deal. The second part 2 of the book is called Green Dreams versus Eco-Apartheid, which I feel like is a good summation of what's there. And so I bring up mostly a series of, what I would call non-reformist reforms for getting us out of this mess. So looking at ideas to bring electric utilities under public ownership, to nationalize the fossil fuel industry, to create a managed decline and a just transition for workers and communities in that sector. Looking at the fight for a federal job guarantee, which I talked a little bit about earlier, and for a nonviolent economy dating back to some of the leaders of the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggles, and finally end on a 4-day work week and kind of a vision for what life could be like under a Green New Deal that would be much more pleasant and leisurely than the one that we have now, and en route to that, get into some nitty-gritty questions about trade and executive powers and how to think through this in a sort of internationalist way. But yeah, roughly first half how we got here, second half how we go forward.
How we get out. By the way, I'm told that it was not your mother who submitted that question. It was Edward Imbeer. So many thanks, and it's a good question. One of the things that's been very interesting to watch about, we were talking earlier about climate journalism, and one of the things that's been very interesting to me to watch is the degree to which it's women who are now producing the bulk of this work and an immense amount of the really good stuff that's going on, and this sort of a kind of climate feminist sensibility emerging. Talk about that a little bit, because I think it's sort of one of the most interesting things that's been happening in the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I think a lot of the sort of cutting edge journalism happening now is happening by women. I think that's in part, a testament to newsrooms getting a bit better, in part through unionization efforts. I am, a proud union media worker at the New Republic News Guild. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to like fall into a sort of trope of saying women are like more connected to the earth or something like that. But I think part of what informs some of the most interesting climate journalism, I think, is looking for stories where looking for stories that aren't told, right? Which often is, folks who are not are not, at the most interviewed for stories and big outlets are not, are kind of suppressed stories. And, I think it's hard to, I think, generalize a bit about, women climate journalists, other than to say that there are a lot of really fantastic women doing this work.
We can recommend that terrific book that came out last year, All We Can Save, which has essays and poems from 42 remarkable women. There's something else to look for the next time you're at Elliott Bay. And I'm told that we actually do have a question from your mother now. And it kind of follows on that one.
I inspired her.
And this is actually a very good question to end on. What keeps you hopeful for the future? And more particularly, sort of following on the last question, one of the other obvious things that's happening is that young people are coming to the fore here. How do you see younger generations inspiring action? What should we take from that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that keeps me hopeful, really is people doing this work. I mean, just in the time that I was reporting this book, right? I pitched it in the summer of 2018, before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was elected to Congress. I'm pretty sure, certainly before the Green New Deal had kind of reemerged into headlines, with that sit into Nancy Pelosi's office. And so even just through the course of writing this book, I've seen the conversation change so much from where it was. I thought I was going to have to write a book about Elon Musk and Michael Bloomberg dominating the conversation about climate change. And, a couple months into the book, that wasn't the case anymore, which is a very, happy development. And so I get to talk to those people who are changing that conversation every day, and got to talk to a lot of people through this book who are doing that. And that's incredible, and I think I'd be very sad if I didn't get to do that. Just had to, rely on my own thoughts and analysis, which I, run up against the limits of pretty quickly if I'm not looking outside it. But yeah, I mean, I think the climate strikes, certainly everything that Greta Thunberg has been doing the last several years has really, injected a lot into this conversation, and the sort of consistent demands that have been coming from the global South. It's one of the I talked about the sort of psychic hardships of attending the UN climate talks, but what keeps me coming back, and I think what makes that such an energizing space actually, is to, you get to talk to people and interview people from all over the world who are, dealing in much more visceral ways, I think, than many people are here with the effects of the climate crisis, but are also, think better ideas. I think it was a sort of lesson in writing this book, and a lesson from the last, five or so years I've been doing this reporting, is that I think the people who are living closest to the crisis, who are, living closest both to climate destruction and to, fossil fuel infrastructure, and dealing with that up front, often have some of the best ideas for how to get out of it. And that's, a sort of wonderful thing to get to explore. As a thinker, I think that's or as a writer, that's like how I process things, is to go out and talk to people about them. And there are some really good ideas that are out there, and there's a lot of exciting cross-pollination across movements about how to take on this crisis. So yeah, that's what keeps me helpful. It's just being a big old nerd.
Well, I can just say with great appreciation that those of us who are old are very glad that younger people, and it's very appropriate too. I'm going to be dead before we're at the worst of all of this, but people your age are going to be in the absolute prime of their lives. And so it makes great sense that they're issuing the call. And it does strike me that it's now the job of the rest of us, maybe especially older people, to listen to that call and back it up. There's a limit to what the Gretas of the world can do because they can't vote. They don't have financial resources yet. And so it's going to take some of the rest of us really standing up. And there's more organizing to come now that we're getting vaccinated. But in the meantime, prepare yourself for what's coming by reading Kate's book, Overheated. It really is something. And it really is a great pleasure to have gotten to talk with you tonight. And just to be able to say thanks publicly for the extraordinary work that you're doing. It's something to watch, and people should read the book, and they should read the New Republic regularly too, to keep track of what you're doing, because it's very much on the cutting edge of the most important questions that the world faces. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. And I'll just say one bit of gratuitous praise for you, just that I don't think I would be doing this if you hadn't, been doing everything you've been doing for a very long time, and particularly, for just modeling kind of what it looks like to do thoughtful, engaged, rigorous writing and reporting, and fighting the good fight at the same time. It's so rare that, people can do both of those things so well, and you manage to encapsulate that in one person, which is, so inspiring. And I strive for that level of balance every day, and haven't found it yet, but keep looking to what you're doing to get pointers.
Candace, thank you so much for your help today. We were really grateful for it, and for making this for Town Hall, just managing to keep figuring out how to keep going during this strange year. We've probably never needed you more, and bless you all for figuring out the ways through.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you both. This has been inspiring, and we're, honored to host you. And thank you so much for all the knowledge and experience and insight that you have brought to us tonight. It's been really great. I'll also plug the book again. I'm going to put the link in the chat again so that you can go right to Elliott Bay, purchase through them, and support a local store. Thank you all so much for your questions and for watching tonight. You can check out more of what's coming up on our online calendar. And as Ware was saying, in the green room, I hope that we can have you both in person soon, maybe next year. But until then, I hope that you both stay safe. Bill, I hope that the second shot goes well for you. And yeah, I hope you both have a great night. Thank you for staying up with us. I know you're both later than we are, so thank you so much.